Hello everyone, welcome back to Final Sector, to our final debrief before the mid-season break. We're recording this a little bit later for a couple of reasons. One, we've got the mid-season break, so there's no real rush to push this one out to get the next one out,
Yes.
So there's that. But secondly, you might notice that Kyle is not where he would normally be recording from. Where are you, Kyle, right now?
Yes, I am in the land of even my former favourite driver, but who am I
wow.
kidding? Still my favourite driver, let's be real here, Mr. Sergio Checo Perez. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to go around and see all the advertising and the signs and everything. So even
nice.
if I'm not in an F1 area of the country, there's still plenty to remind you that
Is he actually
certainly
like,
in his homeland.
Is he actually up there quite a lot? I guess he's probably one of their biggest sort of international superstars.
Yeah. I mean, anything like cars, like service stations, Motor Royal, any of that, you see him all over the place.
Right. Okay. That's cool.
So that's why you kind of see him around. So
yeah, there you go. All right. Well, we'll get straight into. Actually, before we get straight into this one, this is your final chance to get any questions or topics in for our mid-season podcast, which. Depending, I actually don't know exactly when you get back, but we'll probably try maybe for next weekend-ish or around the week, that sort of week. In about a week's time, we'll be recording. We'll get it out probably just before we come back for Zandvoort, I think, is the first one back, isn't it? Dutch Grand Prix. So
yes.
We'll get it out probably a week before then. But get your topics, questions in, anything you want us to talk about. We've got so much. It's just the list keeps getting bigger of stuff we need to talk about, so we don't need anything extra, but if there's anything in particular, please let us know. But let's go into Spa. It was a very wet weekend, as we had seen and predicted. I don't really know where to start. I feel like the race itself, like the feature race, was sort of the least interesting part of the weekend, probably because it was just dry the entire time. So it kind of worked out as we expected, but really I think the first thing I want to talk about is I have to talk about McLaren, because I came in again saying McLaren, I don't know if they're going to be fast here. Like this is sort of the last hurdle for me to see if they actually have a quick car, and they do still have, as we saw here, they do still have a deficit in terms of that top end speed, particularly in the dry. I think a lot of that was possibly due to the fact they probably tuned a lot of downforce into their setup, expecting it to be wet the entire weekend, which almost worked for them. They were exceptionally quick in the wet conditions, and even in the like wet to dry, the slippery conditions on those, the transition to the dry tires when it's still a little bit slippy, that McLaren was just super fast. And in particular, which was really surprising, Oscar Piastri, which we talked about, we had a little conversation, we talked about how Piastri just looked better all weekend over Norris, which is incredible to see. It's not something I don't think either of us expected, because Norris himself he's no mug in the wet, so to be able to outperform Norris in that car is pretty incredible. But how'd you see McLaren's weekend?
Yes, so both, I guess a trend we'll get into is setups. We were coming here, we knew it could be kind of wet, we were hoping not too wet, and as it turned out for all sessions, we had a kind of a nice mix, really. There was a few delays or a few things there to move here and there, but they still got everything running, and a good mix of dry, wet, and that mixed conditions. So that both meant that all the drivers, it wasn't a straightforward kind of weekend for them. So we got to see a few drivers who really, through the sprint and through the normal race, were able to show some stuff. But for setup and for the teams, they really had to pick how they wanted to set that car up.
Yes,
and we were curious about McLaren coming in here, especially for a dry weekend. And we didn't really get a proper answer, because in the slower stuff, in the wetter stuff, they were flying.
Yeah,
they were
faster
and
than
both
Red
of them
Bull.
were flying. They were
Faster than
I
Red
know
Bull,
they were amazing, and even we saw in that sprint kind of quali, even the Red Bulls struggling a bit and not really getting it together when Piastri, especially Piastri and Norris, were seemingly fine. And in that middle sector, you saw their segments, and they were like gaining a second or something.
Yeah,
You're like,
eight
what?
tenths,
That's
8
crazy.
tenths over max. It's like, oh my god,
yes,
it's unbelievable.
And I guess we kind of found out, which was a trend during the race, which I guess was a lot drier than they were hoping, that they lost a lot of time on the straights. But again, you'd less say that's because of the car, but more you have to commit early on for the weekend, especially with a reduced practice, a wet practice, what your setup's going to be. So they gambled that it would be wet, we got to see enough of the sessions that were wet to see it pay off, but you saw in the dry that it didn't pay off. However, still good to see that, as you say, especially Piastri put in a mega performance. Almost
huge.
everyone hoping he would get the pole, but Max, who was struggling, through that session, did put it together to his credit with a mighty lap. But still, everyone else who was out there, who was, you'd say everyone on general equal footing, Piastri, did very well, and I guess was able to, convert to a strong position as well for that sprint too. So really, really good to see.
Yeah.
It's been a few races now in a row where he's been given that opportunity to show, and no doubts whatsoever. There's all the videos coming out is saying, hey, remember those 2 shock moves from moving away from Alpine last year? Well, vindication for both of them now. So.
Yeah, Alpine's a whole other story. That's mid-season podcast. I think we have to go into that because that's a whole 100%. Other thing. But he's definitely made the right move going to McLaren, as I think this race has definitely shown us. But you mentioned the sprint. I guess we can talk about the sprint shootout, sprint qualifying, and then the sprint race. We'll go into that first. It was actually really, really fascinating, like you say, because it was completely wet up until that point. We did have qualifying the day before, which there was like a little bit of dry running then right at the end of qualifying. But even then it was still in like damp conditions, so it wasn't really
drying conditions, which makes it even harder, especially on a long track. You want to be that last man out over the line.
Yeah, exactly.
And we saw a few teams, a few driver in particular, twice in a row somehow get that wrong and not get over the line.
Yes, it was very very odd. Who was it? It was Hulkenberg, I think.
Hulkenberg.
Yeah.
The first time it seemed to be there was an issue there to fix up, and the team just didn't get him out in time.
Yeah.
The second time, which was for the first session for the sprint quali, they just seemed to go, we don't know, we'll just have to check.
Yeah.
He's on the radio going, what the bloody hell are we doing?
I think he missed it by less than a second. He missed the checkered flag, so I think he was just they just timed it wrong, I think. Hulkenberg and the Haas in the wet probably would have made it out of SQ1 pretty comfortably as well. They've generally been pretty strong on 1 lap pace and in the wet, and Hulkenberg has generally been better than Magnussen. So you would have expected them to make it out as well. So I think that's a pretty big blunder from them. Ricciardo did actually make it into SQ2, and Tsunoda didn't make it as well. So that was sort of the start of that. You're like, Ricciardo's actually putting in performances. I think in the actual qualifying, he had a lap time to lead, didn't he, and didn't make it out of Q1 like the day before, I'm pretty sure. So
yes, he did.
Yeah, so this was sort of, I guess, maybe somewhat of a redemption from that quali. The SQ2 was probably the first real interesting one, because this is the one where Stroll went out on he was the only one to go out on those dry tires, which were the mediums. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. We're going to have our return of the FIA shittery episode. Yes. We sure are. I've got a few things to talk about there. But SQ2...
excellent.
Yes. So he came out on the medium tires in that SQ2. The only one to do so, because I think were there a couple of drivers waiting? It might have been Alonso and Albon, I think, were waiting in the garage. Everyone else went out on inters to sort of get in the laps, but everyone was like, a couple of them were like, we think it's close to dry tires, but because the sprint qualifying sessions are quite a bit shorter and the lap is so long, if you think it's going to be dry by the end of the session, you're probably better to wait and then just chuck on the dry tires, maybe get 2 warm-up laps and then go for it.
But that's the big thing, is getting the heat in. So you can't kind of go out in one then change, because that second run you're going to be 2-3 laps losing the heat, which is critical.
So but I think Alonso and Albon both came out on the inters. Stroll, I think, did go out initially on the inters and then came straight back in and then went out on the mediums, and it looked to be an absolutely brilliant move. Like the first half of the lap, absolutely flying, and then just that one corner just had nothing. I think he got a little bit unlucky. I think that track was probably, 2 or 3 minutes off being a genuine dry circuit for slick tires. I think he's just missed it by a couple of minutes, which is really unfortunate. But he does go into the wall, sends out the red flag, and then means drivers like Alonso and Albon, who only came out at the end of the session, had to set their lap, and then couldn't set their lap, and then they got out as well. And then SQ3 was it was
nail biter,
really, really crazy. We had Max did still take pole position, but like you were watching the lap times, and because you say Piastri got P2 in the end, but I think he came across the line first. And then you were looking at Max's.
He was one of the first, and Max was one of the last.
Yeah,
so
but you were looking at
moment of tension.
Yeah, you were looking at Max's times, and you're like, he's lost like a second through that middle sector. There's no way he makes that up. You're sitting there, you're like, oh my god, Piastri's gonna get a pole. And then, obviously, when you know after the fact why he managed to gain so much time, it kind of makes a little bit more sense. But I mean, it was still. You had Verstappen, Piastri, Sainz, P1, P2, P3. They were separated by 0.025 seconds, which I'm sitting there going, that's
nothing.
Probably the closest we've had all year, which was... I think Max didn't have a perfect lap, obviously, but it does show that in sort of those mixed conditions, it does bring the field a hell of a lot closer together.
And we had more of that traffic chaos again. It was another thing we saw, in both sessions, and we've seen the past few weekends where traffic is always an issue. But even here, so many drivers, cutting each other off. I think it was here. I don't remember which session it was. Where
I do remember seeing that, yeah.
I don't know if it was. I think it was Russell again got stuck out. I don't know if he jumped it. Like Hamilton jumped ahead of him, and then he started just before him.
Yeah,
and then Russell binned it in T1 and got in Hamilton's way, and then they were faffing about down the straight. I can't remember. It might have been this session because they both started 7th and 10th, but it was one of them where they just got in each other's way, and it was just messy, even between teammates, even between. Yeah, just drivers. It was, again, another weekend where, as we say, we always deal with this, but just this year, with everyone being so much closer, it feels like everyone's, digging the knife a little bit deeper into each other when they're being cheeky, because they just got to get every inch, every, less second you have to wait for tire warmth can, be as much as 5 places. So it's a trend we're going to see continuing in the second half of the year, especially for Zandvoort. It's going to be huge there because that end section is so important to get a fast run.
Yep. You're going to have that chicane, and then coming into that final bend, I think you're going to see a lot of drivers really cram up there. So you get to the sprint race, which is only a couple of hours after, I think. And you're like, okay, it's probably going to be dry, except that it absolutely pissed down rain literally right before the formation lap, and I think it delayed the start. So we had 4 or 5 laps behind the safety car, and then had a rolling start, which is probably the right decision considering how much spray you could see was being thrown up from the cars. That's obviously the what everyone says is the most dangerous part of particularly this track, but just in wet conditions in general, it's not so much the aquaplaning, it's just that spray, and you could see just how poor visibility was. So, but they did get going because they had to start on the wet tires. It was super interesting with how all the pits went out. It was very, very reminiscent of Hungary.
Another sprint race with a pit strategy.
It was very odd because obviously everyone started on the wets, and by the time they actually got going, everyone was saying it's inters. You just have to have inters. Which that's you could have this whole conversation about what's the point of the wet tires. Sure, that's a whole other conversation.
We discussed on it the last time it was wet, and we'll talk about it in our mid-season. There's a bit going on there.
Exactly.
They're looking into ways to fix it, but irrespective, it was the case where it was another case where we had a sprint where position matters.
Yes.
It was a reduced sprint because we'd had those 4 or 5 laps down. Yep. It's not like it was it was drying, and it would still need to dry uber quickly to make it worth to stop, because it's it's not the worst pit lane, but it's not the best either. You don't really save time. It's kind of average. So you're not going to suddenly, only lose 10 seconds through a pit lane like in Canada or something.
Yeah.
It's still a bit of a penalty.
Yep.
But we did see kind of almost half the field come in a way. I feel like it was a bit of a mix of drivers.
It was exactly half the field, and it was exactly one driver from every team. So it was all 10 teams. So they didn't double stack it was exactly 10 drivers came in after the formation lap. And it was, they didn't double stack anyone, probably because they were all so bunched up, and they thought, just
if you're in the midfield, you go straight to the back. 100%,
yeah.
The
problem is that everyone who pitted on the first time, like who came in after the formation lap before the start, every single one of those drivers got. And I think almost everyone that got that and a good stop, like let's say that didn't get held up in the pit lane or whatever, got an advantage from it. So they actually, and that's how Piastri ended up coming out ahead of Max, because he came in that first stop.
He did come out ahead.
Yes, and Max came out. Max came in on the following lap, and that allowed Piastri to get ahead. But if you look down at like who pitted when, if they pitted on the first lap or the second lap, you'll see that pretty much everyone who pitted on that first lap gained positions, and pretty much everyone who pitted on that second lap lost positions. So I think if you somehow, if you had the choice to come in on that first lap and made that decision, then you benefited from it. So it's
hard still, because even if you double stack at any point, because you got that whole queue, you probably lose more than if you did stay out, right? And there was still a bit of a question mark, right? Like they'd been around behind the safety car going slowly. Even everyone peeling him was almost a little bit of a surprise, right? We were saying, well, is this, right, are they going to be slipping around? And as it turned out, it was, by far the advantageous thing to do. It's a hard thing to predict,
And if you had like all 20 drivers coming in, then imagine the chaos in the pit lane trying to, because it's all squabbling for position in the pit lane,
IndyCar style or supercar style or something.
So it's not like it's different from the Hungary one where the race hadn't started yet, so they came into the pits, and they still, it was just Hamilton obviously on the pit straight. And then everyone else in the pit lane, but the race wasn't at full racing speed yet. Like he still had to come up, they still had to do the lights. So like there's only so much they can do in the pit lane. But when it's at like, hey, green flag racing, and you got 10 plus drivers in the pit lane, it's like they're now squabbling for position. So if you have any more than that, that's when you start having possibly some really big issues in the pit lane. So I'm kind of glad that it sort of worked out the way it did. I think any more than 10 would have been a bit crazy, although that pit lane is quite wide, so it would have helped. If it was somewhere like Zandvoort, for instance, I think that would not have worked. But
it was still satisfying how it worked out.
Yes,
It did make for an interesting finishing order. Like we kind of had Max that started near the front. He lost that position, but he did get it back as well. I guess we were going to expect him to, unless he had some major issue, right? So, but for the rest of the order, it did shake up a little bit, but we still had a bit of a different kind of flavor of podium.
Gasly, I think one of those.
We were speaking of, I was going to say, we were speaking of Alpine's woes, but actually they managed to piece something together here, which was almost, you felt good for them for it.
Yeah. No, it's good. I think Gasly again was one of those drivers that pit on the first lap as well, so got quite close to the front and managed to hold on to a top three, which is really awesome. I'm really happy for him. Perez did have a little bit of a stinker. I think he had a moment where he just couldn't get tires warm or something. He just had literally no grip, and I think there was in the space of about half a lap, he got overtaken by Hamilton, Sainz, and Leclerc. He went from P4 and just dropped to P7. They just absolutely flying past him. So was
it in the?
Oh, it was probably after the.
It was in the sprint. He had the collision with Hamilton.
Yes, he probably.
Hamilton was looking up his inside at a quite an interesting place to overtake, just after the sector 2 line, basically on that fast right-hander before you go into the long back straight.
Yes.
It's pretty hard to pass through there. I think Hamilton did have enough to earn himself some space, but you could tell he kind of slipped out a little bit. Not that I'm saying I'm laying blame on anyone here. I think it's been quite an interesting issue for people to talk about. It was one of those instances where we've had, massive whacks in the past and nothing has happened. This seemed like a very innocent little tap, and it basically shredded open the whole side of Perez's car. Yeah. From that point, especially in these conditions, he just had nothing. There was no grip there. Obviously, he didn't, he couldn't get any drive out of the corners. He had to take everything slowly, and everyone just flew past him. So, again, I guess an argument, he shouldn't have been fighting there anyway. He should have been running away at the front in a way. I'm not going to blame either driver. Hamilton did get slapped with a little penalty for it, which I think is a little harsh, but it's harsh. I mean, technically, yes, it was his fault, and technically he had enough room, but it's still such a minor tap, like.
I think that's racing.
It's one of those instances where if they bumped and nothing happened, you'd go, oh, it's nothing. It's only because there was, a lot of damage, you kind of went, oh, but then, it's like if you take a driver out in a light touch rather than just bounce off each other, I thought that was harsh, but, so yeah, it was unfortunate for both drivers. I guess they had that bit of a bump, but it still made that it was still an interesting sprint, I guess. Look, I don't want to foreshadow. It maybe gave us some false hope for maybe a more interesting race, but it was nice to have some excitement. Again, that's what the sprints are here for. We've maybe been delighted with a bit of mixed up weather or strategy, which is why the sprints are looking even better than before. But if they're all going to be like this, then
what we can get.
We'll take them. Keep them coming. To be honest, it's good to be able to have more racing.
But yeah, I guess we'll touch on the feature race. We had before we go into that though, like the qualifying, we had a slightly different to the SQ, like the shootout. We had Max put it on pole by I think 0.8. Despite nearly being knocked out.
It was just...
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
Yes.
But he nearly got knocked out in Q2. Like he just scraped through.
He barely scraped through in 10th position. Yes. And I think he was lucky. There was a few drivers I think that were out of position that probably could have knocked him down with the time that he had.
Yep.
There was a bit of back and forth on the radio. I think there was obviously some disagreement with how he wanted to do things versus his mechanic, but look, that happens, right? And of course, it turns out they sorted it out, and he put in an absolute stonker of a lap.
Unbelievable.
So, yeah, it was big, but it was look, I think something else that I maybe was hoping for this weekend. We of course had Leclerc in P2. Sainz did well in the shootout quali as well. Got it in P3, I believe. They were both up there, which is what we were hoping for, right?
Yeah.
So and then I guess as we go into the race, I guess some of that speed did translate. It maybe helped that, unfortunately, we had a bit of a classic Spa, someone going to the inside, which, kind of was a 50-50 of working out, and it didn't really work out, unfortunately.
Yes, and it was Piastri, and he obviously was fast all this weekend. That contact, I think racing incident is probably correct. Looking at Piastri's like a lot of people could say, Sainz did lock up. He had Hamilton on his outside. Piastri was alongside, but there was a moment. You look at Piastri's onboard. There was a moment where it's like he could have backed out. Like he absolutely could have backed out, but he's like, "Oh, I'm going to go for it anyway." And it's like, okay,
there is a reason we have seen this happen a lot. We've seen Max famously do it before a few years ago, where he snuck his nose in there, I think, into Raikkonen. And sometimes, if it does work out, you will get a good run, but it cannot work out, and it often causes very bad damage, as we saw here. So
I think racing incident is 100% correct. Because I think Piastri, while he was on the inside, he was more or less alongside, probably should have been given the space. He did have a chance to back out earlier. Sainz did lock up, but he didn't really have anywhere else to go. So
without that lockup, I think it would have been okay, because Sainz was kind of like coming behind Hamilton, and then his lockup forced him to go to the inside, which from his point of view, he did have that space for. It's just unfortunate that the space he couldn't tell kind of needed to be there also for Piastri. So 100% a racing incident. It's one of those where some people, are saying that Piastri could have used his experience. I think, you could say that, but then it's like, well, but then, you get Bottas syndrome, where Bottas would never go for anything like this. So it's almost nice to see him go for it, because if it did pay out, he could have overtaken Sainz, had a run on Hamilton. It would have been brilliant, So
a really good start.
It's the case of Spa. He's going to learn from it, right? It's after his day, he had the prior day. No one's going to blame him. No one's, it's kind of like the classic. It's not really, but it's almost like the classic Gordon Ramsay meme, right? Where everyone's like, "Oh dear, oh gorgeous, it's okay." Like it's okay. You're all good. Don't worry about it. So yes, but it was almost unfortunate that it took both of them out, because the fight for the top and could have been a little more interesting. But I guess two of almost the second and third fastest drivers we'd seen out there that weekend were basically out of it with damage. So it was probably took a little bit of the spice out that we could have had for some of those battles for the podium.
A little bit, yeah. We had Piastri went out almost, I think, immediately, and then Sainz did keep going. He had some minor damage, but he started to drop back, and then eventually retired. Pit stops were all over the place. No one, because it was the only real dry running, no one knew what tyres were going to run long distances, what the life of all the tyres were,
how many stops to do.
Yeah,
etc.
we had the Williams who ended up having to go 3 pit stops, which I watched a video where James Vowles was talking about how the tire like cake tin thing. So when you take the tires off, the cake tins that hold the brakes.
Yes.
Apparently they were just like damaged because there was so much heat going through them, and that's what. There was just so much heat generated into the tires. It was just burning through their tires, and that's why they had to come in for 3 stops. Which is why I was surprised to see Williams so far down, because they should have been probably pretty strong here, and I think they were showing pace. They were quick, and I think it's just the tire degradation that sort of hampered their progress a little bit.
Well, we had a bit of a teaser for that even within the changing conditions, because when we saw at the end of the sprint, there was a comparison of the top 3 drivers and their tires. You saw Piastri and you saw Gasly and their Inters. They seemed to be quite grainy and worn. And then you saw Max's and they looked like brand new. And that's where you went, oh boy, even though this car looks fast, the wear looked insane on it. But it also showed you that, hey, wear's obviously going to be a big thing and a big difference between cars here, where, some may just aggressively stop it, push it, and could make up some pace, while others, may need to push it back, try and for, even a 1 stop if they can. And even as I was partway through the race, it was hard to know, because you kind of saw the field, sorting out. You saw some guys chasing others, but then you were saw the pit area. It was like, oh, this guy's made none, this guy's made 2. You're like, what the hell is going on? What do you mean?
It was very odd. So, and then you had drivers
it was tricky to keep track of.
Yeah, so, you had Norris coming through. He was super. He had a whole other issue where he had steering issues apparently for the first stint, but he was just getting absolutely mugged early on. Straight line speed obviously not helping in the dry, but he did also have some steering issues, which meant he just dropped all the way back. But then he came in on that last stint on those soft tires, and I think he made his way up to P7, was it, by the end? He was
P7. I think I saw something where at one point he was in P15.
Yeah,
I don't know if it was
down.
F1 or the race put out an article on it talking about how it was the hidden strategy of the race, where they, as we said, they had a car that wasn't strong in that dry, and you could see it on the straight, even when Perez just flew past him, right? So he was making his climb. But they said they employed some strategy which meant he can push, and for being at P15 at one point, he still recovered to P7, which you'd say for a car which, was not set up for that conditions at all for that track. Effectively best of the rest. I guess he was behind Russell, Alonso, Hamilton, Leclerc, so kind of the best of the rest in that field anyway, ahead of just ahead of Ocon and Stroll, I think. So credit where it's due. Did what he could with that car. But I imagine there was lots of hidden stories of strategy in there we just missed.
There's so many stories that you could take from this. You could talk about this race quite a lot, because there's a lot to talk about, but it's just so hard to keep track of, again, because there was no pit strategy, really. How they always have, this is the pit strategy, and this is what every team sort of comes to a general consensus that, okay, there's these 2 or 3 strategies that might work during the race.
Option A, option B.
Or in Ferrari's case, option F or something, we'll go plan
Gamma.
F. No team or driver really had that, so it was just they were just sort of figuring it out as they went. So no real driver or team kind of went the same strategy, which makes it very hard to keep track of, but it made it at least a little bit interesting when you see all the chopping and changing, and then Norris coming back through the field. Tsunoda getting P10, and that car looked super, super quick this weekend as well. Although Ricciardo would say otherwise.
It was a fierce fight for that P10 too.
Yes,
you
it
thought
was.
The last 10 laps, 6 different drivers had it going up and down all over. So,
So, we had Perez did end up getting the P2 in the race. I think he qualified P3 in qualifying, and then obviously Max had his I didn't even mention that, the 5-second penalty for the gearbox change. It didn't matter. He ended up 22 seconds ahead of Perez by the end of the race anyway, which obviously you could realistically predict in the dry. And then Leclerc gets that P3. But I think we saw it on the broadcast. I guess we'll touch on Max a little bit. You see him coming up behind to overtake Perez on track, and you just see just how much faster and how much smoother he is, and he's just hitting every apex, and he's like the control he has over that car compared to Perez in the same car. You're just looking at it from Max's perspective. You're like, he's just faster. He could overtake anywhere he wants to right now, because he's just hitting the absolute like. If you turned on racing line on like those F1 games, you have the racing line, like this is the optimal racing line. Max is following that on rails, whereas particularly T1, you had Perez went just a little bit wide, and then Max just takes that slightly more inside, gets a really good run, even backs out of the throttle at the top, so that way he doesn't catch him too quickly going through a Rouge and Raidillon, and then just fucking flies past him, and you're just like, this is like, Max is different level compared to Perez. Just watching that on board for what the third of a lap, half of a lap, you're just thinking, oh my god,
it's not so just good. The car, and you'd say
good.
You'd say there are other drivers that might be able to match it, but no, you're okay. There's other drivers that could match it, but it's that's why people call him a great, right? You just sit on an onboard and you can just see the smoothness and everything, and it's that fact he has that pace and that tire wear, right? That's something big that although the car can provide, it's a big thing the driver needs to provide. That's what we've seen sometimes Alonso be good at too, is being able to push the car but also conserving the tires. Even say, a case where he was in another team, he'd still be crushing it, right? So it's just one of those lethal combinations, and this weekend a perfect example in every session of why he's just as good as he is. It's it earns respect even if you wish he wasn't as far ahead, but it's crazy.
It's mental.
Legends and records being made right here. What was it, like Red Bull got the record now for the most races as a team in a row? They got it from McLaren last weekend, so now they're pushing wins, that. Max, I think, is... Max, I think, is 1 or 2 off like being most wins in a row, which I think he might take from Vettel from his Red Bull years, which you'd say at this point, look, he's going to Zandvoort. If he doesn't do it there, that'll be a big shame. We're witnessing something else, that's for sure. At least we saw Perez getting P2. Like, good. That's where he should have been. Where he should be. Yes. It's good enough. Just keep doing that at least if Max is going to be this good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think even... It's crazy how, like, even his own team, like Red Bull, are basically just saying, like, he basically just can't. He's just not going to be able to challenge Max. He just needs to fight for P2. And it's like, I think even Perez will say otherwise, like, kind of has to. But even he has to realize, like, he's fighting for P2 now, right? Like,
yes, of course. So it's got to be realistic.
I guess the other thing is that Hamilton decided to steal the fastest lap, so Max doesn't get the clean sweep. But he had that free pit
that was
stop.
Funny. He had a little bit of a gap and decided to go for it. That was good. I guess we do have to make sure we end on your revival of our very favorite series. Get our favorite little tune back up and going again. It's the only reason people tune in. It's the only reason they wait till the end.
Of course. The SQ2 incident, obviously, this is when Stroll went out on the mediums, and normally what happens when you have like wet to dry conditions and someone's deciding to go on the slicks, they'll go onto the softs. So sprint qualifying is a little bit different in the sense that SQ1 and SQ2, you're required to use the mediums. SQ3, you're required to use the softs.
That's right.
So proviso is that if the track is declared wet and you go on to dry tyres and you decide to go on to dry tyres, you get free range. So you can choose whatever dry tyres you want.
As it is in the race, if at any point it's declared wet, the minimum requirements go out the window.
Yes, exactly. The FIA decided not to declare it a wet track, even though it was quite clearly a wet track. Okay. So that way, if the drivers decided to go out in SQ1 and SQ2, they had to go out on the mediums because it wasn't declared a wet track. They weren't allowed to use the softs.
But why? What is that all about?
That's a great question. The FIA said they deemed the tyre warm-up of the mediums to be just as good as the softs, which is a flat-out lie. That is that's a safety concern, isn't it? Like they've just basically said we're not going to declare it a wet track. The purpose of declaring
the track, is not to enable or disable the use of other tires. That's not the purpose of calling a track wet. There are other reasons that they call a track wet.
Yes, exactly. This is actually the reason they said why they did it is so they could come. So they have to come out on the mediums on SQ1, SQ2, and that's the reason why Stroll came out on the mediums and not the soft. And you look at it, you're like, why didn't he come out on the softs? And it's like, that's why he wasn't allowed to. If he came out on the softs, he probably would have been disqualified.
Wow.
And that's probably like if he had those softs, would he have gone into the wall? Would he have had a bit more temperature in the tyres to be able to hold it through that corner? Who knows? Well done, FIA.
I didn't pick up on that.
Fucking done.
That's good. Ooh. That's a good one to end off the mid-season. That's classic FIA.
God, I love it.
Not just like, they did, a little fucky wucky. This is just like just a oops, we don't know what we did. Yeah. Classic.
Yep. That's stupid. That's so stupid. I was so angry when I fucking heard that. I was so angry.
Fantastic.
Let us know your thoughts on that, because I was not happy. I thought that was a very, very, very stupid decision. And
it's something that to most, I guess, would seem intangible. Like I didn't even realize that at the time.
Yeah.
But when you hear it through and you hear they didn't even have a good reason, you again go, look, this isn't some backyard cricket fucking toy car race. This is F1. Like surely something's broken down here that really should never ever.
Yeah, exactly. Especially somewhere like where there's been so much talk about the safety in the wet, particularly 100%. At this track, and they're just like, actually, we're just going to ignore that for this particular rule because why? Like, I don't get it. Like, it's just a brain fade from the FIA. I think I don't really get it. But yeah, like I said, let us know your thoughts. I guess we'll end on that. But let us know your thoughts on the weekend. On the season so far as well. We'll be breaking that down, plus all the big stories again in our mid-season podcast that we're recording in about a week or so. Hopefully, the second half of the season is even more exciting than the first. I think there's still a lot more stories to be told. I think McLaren's rise coming through. I think. If Aston Martin can find something...
If you had to pick which team is going to come P2, I don't know how you could pick it.
It's hard.
Like, if it wasn't hard enough already, it's now even harder. It's insane. This is crazy.
Definitely.
I know everyone's going, just take Red Bull out of the championship and look how insane this is. It's like, well, just look at it like that then. Like, if that's getting your excitement going, bloody hell, go for it. That's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, definitely. So, but yeah, we'll talk about... Big discussion coming up soon. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that. But stay tuned. We'll see you in a few weeks for our big mid-season podcast. Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your holiday, Kyle. And
we'll do.
We'll see you next time.